Hello, my name is Zach Gibbs, and I am a content developer within education services inside Juniper Networks. And today we will be discussing the Configuring AppFormix Dynamic Alarm Rules Learning Byte. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump right to the example. In this example, we have 4 hosts. We have an AppFormix controller. Then we have the OpenStack node, which has the SDN controller functionality. And then we have 2 compute nodes, compute 1 and compute 2. And on those compute nodes, we have VMs that are sending traffic between each other. And what we want to do is we want to configure a dynamic alarm rule that includes compute 1 and compute 2. So we're going to monitor the ingress bandwidth of those 2 compute nodes. Now we could set this up to where we monitor bandwidth usage for the VM instances, but in this instance, in this example, we're going to be using this dynamic alarm rule to monitor the overall traffic for the compute nodes. So that would include all VMs on those compute nodes. And then with the dynamic threshold, we are going to use the k-means baseline analysis algorithm. It's going to have a daily learning period, and the sensitivity is going to be set to high. Then we're going to set the severity to an information level, and we're not going to use any notification services. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and jump to the AppFormix user interface and get this going. All right, so here is the AppFormix interface. We can see we're in the dashboard. We see the management infrastructure. That's all normal. Great. So first, let's go ahead and move to let's go to an aggregate. We have the aggregate set up already that encompasses both compute 1 and compute 2 nodes. And we can see that here it's called compute. So we can click on that and actually clicked on the charts for this so we can actually see what's going on here. And we actually have a chart already set up for ingress bitrate. So it's host.network.ingress bitrate. We can see what's going on here. We can see we have some traffic going back and forth. And that's great. That's what we want to see. We see that there's actually communication there. So let's go ahead and jump to the alarms workspace. Now we could use the ribbon on the right that allows us to configure alarms and whatnot. But let's go ahead and just go to the alarms workspace. And it looks just the same as that ribbon. But I did want to show you where the alarms workspace was. And we can see we have some event-based alarms, some instance risk transition stuff, and instance health transition. That's just what happened when we brought up some and messed around with some VMs earlier. So let's go ahead and click the Add Rule button, and you'll see this bar pop up on the side. And here is where we're going to set the different parameters. So we need to name it first. We're going to call this host ingress BW for bandwidth, and then alarms. That's fine for the module. We can set alarms or service alarms, and we're going to stick with alarms right here. Service alarms has to deal with the different services like the Contrail services. We want to just set a straight up alarm that monitors bandwidth usage. And then we need to set the alarm rule type to dynamic. It defaults to static, change that to dynamic. The scope, now the scope tells us what we're looking at. Right now we're looking at host, and that's exactly what we want to do, but we could change that if necessary. We could change that to instant, network device, virtual network, remote host. We could change all that if necessary, but we want to set that to host. And then under aggregate, we can set it to all, compute 1, compute 2, AppFormix platform, AppFormix network agents, OpenStack controller. And then we have this last one, which just says compute. Now that's the aggregate that I created earlier that has both compute 1 and compute 2. So we'll select that. And then under generate, we can select generate alert or generate event. With what we're doing, we want to use the generate alert. That'll create an alert when something happens. And then we want to choose the metric. Now we have to choose the host network ingress bit rate for what we want to do, because this will monitor the ingress bandwidth usage. Okay, under when, we want to select average. So we want to say when average is greater than something. Now, under interval, we didn't talk about this in the example or in the slides, but what interval is for is how often we're going to have the different intervals. With alarm rules, there's going to be kind of a sliding window. There's going to be certain sets of intervals. And if we match the condition on so many intervals, then an alarm is going to be raised. And we're going to set this at 15 seconds. Normally, you wouldn't set this low, but I want the alarm to be generated quickly so we don't have to sit there for a while. Now, under the is field, we want to set above. So when it's above a certain average or whatever the average is, and we're going to have to learn that average first of all. Okay, and then under here we select the dynamic threshold parameters. Notice that it says dynamic threshold Mbps, megabits per second, so that's what we're going to be going off of. If we were to change the metric, that would change. It would show something else than Mbps or megabits per second if we change the metric to like CPU usage or something. So let's go ahead and change the baseline analysis algorithm. We have 2 options, k-means and EWMA, and we'll select k-means. learning duration period. Now we want to set this to daily, because what happens here, if it's set to daily, it'll update the information hourly. It'll record it hourly. And then after that, it'll actually clear the information every day. That's what it means. Now we set for hourly, it will clear the information hourly. So we want to set it to daily so we can get some of that historical information. Then we set the sensitivity to high. So what that means, you have low, medium, and high. And if the variance is low, it's not going to trigger the alarm. If it's high, the variance is high, then it will trigger the alarm. It's set to high. Set to low. There's got to be a low amount of variance to trigger that alarm. We're going to set this to high. And the severity. Now this is just local information to AppFormix controller. And we're going to set that informational. So if the alarm goes off, it's just an informational alarm. It's nothing too bad. And then we scroll down. We see notification. We don't have a notification service set up with this, so we're not going to worry about that. But you could set PagerDuty, a custom service, ServiceNow, which is Juno Space application, or Slack. And you would set the notification service up in the settings option. We're not going to go over that since we're just going to leave that at none. And then there is the advanced field, or rather fields. And under here, you can set the intervals with exception and also the of last intervals. And what this means, I did talk about the intervals in seconds field earlier. And I talked about that tells you how many or how short the intervals are that have to match up before an alarm is raised. And what this is saying here, it says intervals with exception. So there needs to be one interval with exception of the last 1 intervals. You can change this if you like. You could set this to 2 intervals with exception of the last 10 intervals. So that would make the alarm happen a lot less often. But how it is by default, it's just 1 interval with an exception of the last 1 intervals. And that means if there's any intervals with exceptions, it will trigger the alarm. So let's go ahead and click save and see what happens. And keep in mind that we do have traffic flowing. So there has been traffic flowing for a little bit. And so it's going to get that historical information. So right now we click on the alarm rule that we just created. It's going to show that it's learning. Now this will just take a minute or so of learning. And keep in mind that it doesn't start the learning process from right now. What it actually does is it starts and gathers historical information because the alarm rule hasn't been alive for that long. So it will gain or gather historical information and then make a decision from there if it's above the average what it should be. So this will take just a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video until it transitions out of the learning state, and we'll go from there. All right, so we can see here that there are some alarms. We can see the alarm icon up top, and then on the right, we can see that the host ingress bandwidth alarm rule is triggered. We see a 2 there in red as well. And so why it shows 2 is because we have 2 hosts we're monitoring. And so we can click on the host ingress bandwidth alarm rule. We can see that we have a few different alarms. And so we see that there's 2 alarms triggered for each host. But that is just that it was triggered twice. And so there's really only 2 actually happening right now, 2 alarms. And we can see here that we have a network ingress bitrate of almost 30 megabits per second. And the baseline is 0.01 megabits per second. And why is that baseline so low? Because that's what they were doing in the past. They weren't really passing any traffic, so it's way above what the actual average is. And so that's really what we're looking for. And if we continue to let that traffic run as it is consistently for a long period of time, we'll be able to see that that should even out and that alarm will end up going away on its own if we just let it run, probably for a couple days or so. But we don't really have that much time in this Learning Byte to do that, so we won't worry about doing that part of it. But as you can see here that the alarm went from the learning state, and if I would have been continuously recording, you would have seen it went to the inactive state and then quickly transitioned into the active state. And so right now we have it in the active state. The alarm is triggered. This is what a dynamic alarm looks like when it's triggered and how it's created. Okay, so the one other thing I do want to show is if we go over the actual alarm rule, if we highlight it or hover over it with the mouse, it highlights it and gives us some information. It says generate aggregate alert. That's for our aggregate. For host in compute, that's our aggregate's name. For network ingress bitrate, if average is over 15-second duration interval above dynamic threshold in one of the last 1 intervals. So it gives us a little information. Then we can also click the gear icon here. And if we do that, we get some information. And this is really neat because it'll give you historical information of what's happened over the last day. We can see that, there's really not any bandwidth usage. It's really low throughout the entire day. And then we can see at this one point it spikes. And that's when I turned on the traffic is when it spiked. And you can see that the average, or where it's spiking to, is well above the average. And so that'll give you some information there. And another thing you can do is we can show the notifications, add notifications and whatnot, the add button there. We could clone this rule or duplicate the alarm rule and then make adjustments to it. And then we can also delete the alarm rule. So that brings us to the end of this Learning Byte. In this Learning Byte, we discussed how to configure dynamic alarm rules. And then we demonstrated how to verify and see the results of that dynamic alarm rule. So as always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Networks Certification Program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.